So good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Good morning to some of you. Thank you for joining us. Today is quite an auspicious day. Not only is it as the sun's setting in Israel, nearing the beginning of Yom Hashoa, it's also, as Andrea just mentioned, the 20th of April, which is Hitler's birthday. And it's also the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it's all these different things wrapped in together. And this evening actually came out of an idea that Rachel had. And most of you don't need the introduction of who Rachel is, but I will say that she is really one of the most significant, some would say spectacular scholars, not only of the Shoah, but also of Israeli society and Hebrew literature. And we're very, very pleased that she is offering her services and offering her ability and know-how and knowledge. Rachel and I have had the opportunity of walking around Jerusalem and all kinds, not only in Jerusalem, all kinds of different places, with her engaging in poetry and me engaging in what we see and how it connects and all kinds of interchanges in all kinds of different ways. And Rachel came up with the idea on Yom HaShoah, or to commemorate Yom HaShoah, to actually take a virtual visit to Yad Vashem, not just a kind of tour of Yad Vashem, but looking at Yad Vashem in a bit of a different way. And some of you I know have been to Yad Vashem with me, some have been to Yad Vashem with Rachel. Many of you have heard Rachel give either an introduction or conclusion to Yad Vashem. And so we hope that today might add a bit more onto what you've already had and seen and done. For those of you that haven't been to Yad Vashem before, hopefully you'll get a bit of an introduction. Unfortunately, we can't go into the museum. And what we're going to do today is we're actually going to look at the outside of Yad Vashem, but not only what there is in the outside of Yad Vashem, but how it represents the meaning of what Yad Vashem was intended for. And so we'll start. Rachel, do you want to add anything to those words?
Yes, I was thinking exactly on adding one thing, that especially since the last 15 years that we have the new historical museum at Yad Vashem, I think most of us, including people such as yourself, running and planning those incoming touring opportunities for people, and people such as myself offering lectures and such, that we have totally shifted our attention to the new historical museum at the cost of neglecting the campus. And I think the main difference at the times when we were still offering these tours of the outside of the campus of Yad Vashem is that you go to the historical museum at Yad Vashem to study the history of the Holocaust. But if you visit the campus of Yad Vashem, you will get an idea not of the Holocaust, but rather of the way Israel had opted in different periods to commemorate the Holocaust. And when I first started creating this type of tours, I called them notions of commemoration. So I'd like to include that thought that we are not going to study that much about the Holocaust today, but rather about the way Israel had addressed it through Yad Vashem. Will you take it from here, Ezra?
Yes. So I couldn't agree with you more. And the truth is that Yad Vashem, and we always say to pretty much to everyone coming to Yad Vashem is not visiting a museum. Yad Vashem is visiting the site of National Memorial. And Yad Vashem isn't just a site of National Memorial, it's part of a much larger complex called, in Hebrew, Har HaZikaron, or Memorial Hill. And it's a place which is divided into two main areas, the upper part being Mount Herzl, and the lower part being Yad Vashem. And Yad Vashem is nestled on the side of that mountain. And if you look at the picture you see in front of you, you can see the complex of Yad Vashem straight in front of you. And almost everything on that slope of the mountain is connected to one sort of element or another that really tries to convey a message of not only history, not only place, but also space. And we entitled this Memorial Space, Transcendent Place, because it is a space of memory, but it's also a space and a place of transcendence. And what we'll try to do today is look and see how some of those sculptures, buildings, places, spaces were, one, created, and two, intended to allow for one, learning, but also commemorating, documenting, which is what the three main things that Yad Vashem is about, but also giving people place and space to find themselves in the very, very difficult and tragic quagmire of the Shoah. And if you look at the picture you see in front of you, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner where the buses are parked, you see some open spaces. Those open spaces, just before a kind of roundabout, those open spaces are in fact representative of gates. And those gates are intended to represent the exit or entrance into the city. And in fact, Har Herzl, the cemetery, is also on the outskirts of the city, but there is another set of gates leading into Yad Vashem, representing another place. It's a space which is literally removed from the overall conversation. And when Yad Vashem was initially thought of, believe it or not, in 1942, during the Shoah itself, by a representative of the Jewish National Fund, the idea was to try and find a place that would allow the Jewish people to remember, not even knowing what was going on. It went through a number of different renditions. And eventually the cornerstone was laid in 1953 with the construction of the site beginning soon after that in 1954. And as we continue, you'll see all kinds of progressions. And before we go on to that one next progression, if you were to get into a helicopter today and fly over Memorial Hill where you see Yad Vashem and Mount Herzl and continue off toward the southern part of Jerusalem, you would fly over Givat Ram, which is the hill or the mountain of Jewish sovereignty. And that hill and mountain of Jewish sovereignty is where the Knesset is, where the Prime Minister's office is, and now where all the government offices are. And it's not by coincidence, where you have a memory mountain and a sovereignty mountain. And we'll focus on that mountain of sovereignty today, the mountain of memory, but that mountain of memory is constantly geographically and figuratively and actually practically connected to that mountain of sovereignty. Rachel, we're going to move on.
Please. Ezra.
Ken, we're moving on. The problem is that we have one bit of text that doesn't work in the slide. Here we are. Rachel.
Do you need me to do anything?
Just about, were you going to relate to this text?
I don't see the text, and I suggest Ezra. Here it is now. Okay, so thank you. And you cannot put it in the presentation mode. Is that what you're saying?
Just this one text. That's correct.
Just this one text. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know, I'm working on sessions that I'm doing myself every day for you, night for me here. And in research is something I came this very morning across this little article in the Devar newspaper from Devar. Actually, it shouldn't be May 30th. It was April 30th in 1954 when they decide on the inauguration of Yad Vashem. And here is what they say. So the ceremony took place in the presence of the president of the state of Israel and his wife, the prime minister, education, culture, etc., etc. There was prayer said, there was a tree planted, and lots of important stuff. And if you want, both Ezra and I can email you the text. What I'd like you to do is go about halfway down the text, where on the left-hand side at the beginning of a paragraph, it says Tzvia Lubatkin. Tzvia Lubatkin is one of the most famous ghetto fighters. It is during this year that she and some of her colleagues, ghetto fighters as well, will publish an extremely important book about the ghetto fighters. And she's addressing the audience and she is saying, Tzvia Lubatkin described the revolt and ensuring battle and heroism in the ghettos if they were with us today, we would see them amongst the conquerors of the road to Jerusalem, among those who made the barren hills flourish, among those who were now defending our borders, etc., etc. I think now, Ezra, you can, as I continue to say a few words, switch us to the next slide and to the presentation mode that I'm waiting for very, very badly. So as this is going to happen, thank you. I'd like to say that one of the issues that we would like to pay attention to is that in the preliminary thinking of commemoration, as well as in throughout the different monuments that we are going to visit in the Yad Vashem campus, what is the relationship between the Shoah per se, within the Shoah, the ghetto fighters, the uprising, the partisans, etc., the physical fighters, and the state of Israel? And I think, Ezra, you need to pick up at this point by suggesting the physical connectedness, what they call Hashvil HaMechaber, the connecting path between Yad Vashem and Mount Herzl, just connecting the two notions. Take it over.
If you look at this path, you'll see that there's a description on the right, connecting path or Hashvil HaMechaber. It's the path that goes from Mount Herzl, the military cemetery, to Yad Vashem. And the other two words that could be used to describe this path are Mishoah L'Tkuma. This is a direct physical connection between Shoah, disastrous destruction, and Tkuma, rebirth. That one set of words, Shoah L'Tkuma, is a set of words which follows the establishment of the State of Israel from its inception, and even, one may dare say, before its inception. If you just look at some of the documents that were used by those people who initiated Yad Vashem before the state was established and continued between the end of the Shoah and the beginning of the State of Israel. And that question of Shoah L'Tkuma is a question which is not really a question for many, but it is a fact which carries through reality of the Jewish people from the destruction of European Jewry through the establishment of the State of Israel, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a very, very difficult conversation because it raises numerous questions on what was, in fact, the nature of the Yishuv, the nature of those Jews living in the State of Israel before the Shoah and during the Shoah. And what place does the Shoah play in Israeli society? What place does memory from 1948 or the battles for the land play in Israeli society? How do they weave between themselves? And how do they stand on their own? And what we'll try to do today, in fact, is look and see how some of those things play out in reality. Let's move on to the next slide.
If your PowerPoint doesn't move, let me know. I'll tell you what to do.
It's not, there we go.
Okay. Right.
Rachel, do you want to take this?
Okay, so here we are at the entrance to the new Yad Vashem. This is where, if I were to lead you tour, I'll be waiting until you get off the bus. And once you have done that, I will probably ask you to sit where these very soldiers are sitting. And I would ask you to turn your back to the entrance of the building and look at me standing at the other side. And can you click twice, Ezra, so we have the two additional pictures? And I will talk to you about the notion of the place itself. And you can see that I have added two pictures to the slide. One on the top is the Herzl grave on top of the hill that you will be facing if you were standing where the soldiers were. And the other one is the military cemetery, which is on the slope of the other hill. And I will tie the three together for you as the planners of this place have done. And now we have on top of the hill, Herzl buried, the visionary who couldn't have foreseen the Holocaust. No way he could have. but he had a sense of an impending danger. And he does speak about the need to evacuate Europe, he and other leaders, such as Jabotinsky. At the bottom of his feet, if you will, because he's buried on top of the hill, is Yad Vashem, the place commemorating that which he would have wanted to prevent. And on the other slope, unseen by us, but yet still in our concept, is the military cemetery, where soldiers who fought for the existence of the state of Israel and still do are buried. And so, like, you go the vision, the peril, and the daily cost that one needs to pay for the maintenance of that dream come true by Herzl. The whole thing together now is named Har HaZikaron, the Mount of Commemoration, and it is placed at the west end side of the city. Now think in terms of Jerusalem and in terms of tour guiding, and there are quite a few of you guys tour guides in the group, and you know that this idea of connecting a Jewish memory to a mountain is not exactly a novelty when the people who create Yad Vashem and who create that place are thinking in connecting memory to mountain. Because my goodness, we have mountains in our collective memory. From Mount Sinai at the beginning of our road, all the way to Har HaBayit to Temple Mount. And one of our writers already as early as the 80s have addressed this topic about how modern Jerusalem actually lies between these two poles. And he called it Hakir ve'ahar, Hakir being the wall, namely Western wall, namely Temple Mount, and Har HaZikaron, the Mount of Commemoration. And he talks about the fact of how your life in Jerusalem is somehow moving between these two poles. Okay? Ezra, would you want to add anything to that notion?
Just to remember that when you talk about all the great mountains of Jewish tradition, there's really only one mountain that has been physically identified, most people believe, and that is the Temple Mount. When you talk about Mount Nebo, when you talk about Mount Sinai, when you talk about places which are so significant and seminal to Jewish existence, we have no idea, well, we have an idea, but we don't really know where they are, on the one hand, to one which is the wall that's talked about is not just representative of the wall, it's representative of the whole mountain. And you have the two mountains where we know where they are, and yet those two mountains represent two very, very different things to very different groups within Israeli society. And to others, they meld together and weave together. And some would say that the Aleph Bet Yehoshua is the person who wrote Akir V'Ahar, and it's seen as one of the basic documents of Israel's civil religion. The civil religion, which now we're going into its heyday, in fact, from the end of Pesach into Yom HaShoah, leading up to Yom HaZikaron and leading up to Yom HaAtzmaut, which we'll clearly see more of that later on as we move on. Rachel, are you ready to move on?
Yeah, just I move on, and as we are walking through the entrance lobby, and you click, I will remind all those of you who have been blessed with tour guides who somewhere along the trip to Israel have read Tourists by Amichai to you. In that poem, Amichai does this same thing. He came down to the old city. And let us move through the entrance lobby and into the other side of that building. And I hope the clicks work for you, Ezra. If no, I have the magic solution.
I think we did it. Yes? Have we done it?
So we crossed the building, not before we picked up our earphones, and the tour guide picked up their bike and left their ID card to make sure that they will be returned. And we are exiting on the other side. And that is important to me because when we stand original entrance to Yad Vashem, the ones that the planners of the 50s have foreseen, not that huge square, and not the gate-like structure, etc., and not this fancy lobby that we now have with the entrances and the restaurant downstairs and what have you. What they had was a little circle that sort of came just to the beginning of the path here, the alley, and then you would get off your bus, your taxi, whatever, and you will start walking. And if you had that sense, wow, I came to the Holocaust Memorial and I need to see these atrocities, etc., the mere structure of the site said, hang on, rega, not so fast. The atrocities will wait. We'll talk about ghettos and yellow stars and trains and gas chambers, whatever. But before you rush so quickly off to face evil, will you take a moment to walk peacefully through the alley of the righteous Gentiles and recognize the good? I know at least about one rabbi among you, haven't noticed others, so I'll talk to you, Marie, and the notion of hakarat hatov, that you so often, I know, must be talking about, the recognition of the good. Evil is so apparent in our eyes, is so easy to see, and therefore the recognition of the good. So I will ask you, Ezra, to click just once more so I get the picture that I need in order to address that. The righteous Gentiles, you all know, I'll repeat, however, are those people, non-Jews, who have risked their lives, oftentimes the life of their families, more than once the life of the whole town in which they lived or the village, to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. Now we know how hard it is to teach people to do that which is legally recognized as good. But during the years of the Holocaust, helping Jews is illegal. And have you ever asked yourself the question, how do you educate people to do the good when it's forbidden? How do you get people, such as the righteous Gentiles, who when the law says it is forbidden, yet will say, well, there are times that laws need to be refused? The question to me is, you remember maybe a few minutes ago when I addressed the issue of the campus of Yad Vashem being a place where we do not go to learn about the Holocaust, but about notions of commemoration. Now that the Holocaust is over, now that you have a state of Israel, how are you going to recognize these people? So in other cultures, they would probably get a monument or a medal or a scroll. And in our Jewish culture, what do? We plant a tree, because this is what we do. We plant trees in order to recognize a fact that needs to be recognized. So I gave you a picture of what trees are planted here in the original alley of the righteous, alley of the righteous Gentiles, and it's a carob tree. So I wish I could have the conversation that I would have with you had I been making sure that you are standing in the shade and we can discuss that. And you will probably see me on the left-hand side. There is that first tree, which is my favorite. And I will go underneath and bend and pick up a carob fruit. And there are always some on the ground. And so I know I can pick them up. And sometimes they are still fresh and on the tree, just like in this picture. And then I will ask some of the younger people to get me one. Why did we choose a carob tree? So let us think back in our tradition. And carob tree, I can think of 3 examples where carob tree is mentioned with a very particular connotation. And let me see if you can tell me at least one. So if anybody knows, what you should do is unmute yourself, say your name, and tell me of an example where a carob tree is mentioned in our sources. Can you do that for me?
Sure. Elijah the prophet.
Yeah, what about him?
Well, he was running away from Ahab and Jezebel out into the desert. And before he heard the still small voice, God sent a bird and a carob tree to feed him.
Okay, so that's a 4th. I was not thinking about that.
Oops, sorry.
I totally appreciate that. And please remember to mute yourself. And let us look for another. Marie.
Magal.
Chonia Magil. So here's the story that many of us know about this guy who looks at this old man who's playing a trade and says, "What are you doing, man? I mean, until this story will go through the man." And the man says to him, "Chonia Magil, well, I know that."
Up. We can't
Jerry,
understand.
please mute yourself.
You're breaking up.
I am breaking up. This is because
Rachel,
I'm
can you
getting...
repeat yourself?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I need to remember to keep my distance from the mic. Okay, so this guy asks Chonia Magil, "What are you doing planting this tree? By the time it bears fruit, you'll be too old, maybe dead." And Chonia Magil says to him, "I know that, but when I came to the world, there were carob trees around. So other people have planted them for me before I was born, maybe. Carob tree thus stands in our tradition for the man who seek immediate gratification, but knows that there was stuff before and there'll be a future." Start connecting these notions and how maybe they are connected to the righteous Gentiles. Could you give me another example? Carob tree in our tradition. I'll tell you anyway, but just in case somebody would like to jump in.
מערת אודי,
Yeah.
המערה בצפת של רבי שמעון, רבי...
Yeah, exactly. And we speak
Yochai.
English in this session. Okay, thank you, Udi. So here is the story. It's the time of the Romans. They forbid their custom was in the different nations they created. And by doing prohibitions, they were helping for the
Hi,
culture
Raphael.
to... Yeah,
Can you repeat the sentence? Can
how are you
repeat the
doing
sentence?
now?
Now it's fine.
Okay, so by eliminating those things, the hope was that that culture will disappear and there'll be a unified Roman culture. In our case, they prohibit the celebration of the new moon, namely your calendar, your holidays, Brit Milah, the celebration of who you are in your own body, if you happen to be a male, and the study of Torah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, knowing that there are times that laws are not to be adhered to, will hide in a cave and they will study Torah. And the legend says that God Almighty, in his ultimate generosity and wisdom, will provide for them a carob tree at the entrance to the gate, so that the cave so that they can sustain themselves. And the last one, I'm not sure anybody will remember him. I'll give it like flip short time and see if people remember. And if not, I'll tell you. But you will need to watch my hands, because it's all about Rabbi Ched, that he could sustain himself with kav shel charuvim. And kav is the amount that goes within your two hands. And therefore, he was such a modest man, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, that he will sustain himself with the carob kav from one end of Shabbat to the entrance of the other. Now, tie these things together, and I'm still thinking about how to tie Elisha in, but I'll do the three that I'm familiar with. It's not about immediate gratification. It's about knowing there was and there will be. It's about knowing when laws are not to be abided by. And it's about minimum sustenance to maintain life. And now collect all these three and see how beautifully they rhyme with the notion of the righteous the Gentiles. And when I teach people all that as we stand there, they will oftentimes ask me, Rachel, do you think that the righteous Gentiles know all these Talmudic stories? And I will say, of course not. But you see, that is exactly the point. They don't need these stories. They know what to do. We need the stories. We need the connections. The ally of the righteous Gentiles is not for the righteous Gentiles. It's for us to remember that even at the worst of times, man can have choices. I think we'll stop there as we walk by, Ezra, and why don't you lead us to our next stop? And maybe add to this if you want to.
So no, I'll just add something which is, it's kind of jarring from what you just said, not to take anything away from the righteous among the nations, but the thought was brought up at one point to try to plant as many trees, or not as many trees, but to plant a tree for every Jew who was killed in the Shoah, murdered in the Shoah, on the mountain of Yad Vashem, and what the mountain would look like and how different it would be if there were not only trees for the righteous among the nations, but for the victims of the Shoah. And then if you flip it and say, what would have happened if there had been so many more righteous among the nations, what the mountain might have looked like? Which kind of takes me on to the next, as we walk further, and that is that the word Shoah and the word Holocaust, we're using them interchangeably, and yet they're two very, very different words. With Holocaust being a Greek word that comes from sacrifice by massive fire, and Shoah being a Hebrew word, which means total destruction, without the element of sacrifice. And then if you go back to Aleph Bet Yehoshua, and what happened on that mountain that he relates to in his reference to the Kir, the wall of the Temple Mount, that was a mountain of sacrifice. But Yad Vashem is not a mountain of sacrifice, because when you think about it, what can be worth a sacrifice of 6 million people? And so keeping that in mind, from here on in, generally when I'm guiding through Yad Vashem, I never use the word Holocaust and only use the word Shoah, because Holocaust refers to another place in Europe in modern English, but it refers to sacrifice, which this mountain is not, which also relates to the concept of Shoalet Kuma. When you talk about Shoalet Kuma, you can talk about from destruction to rebirth. You can talk about it in terms of there was destruction and then there was rebirth. Or you can talk about it in terms of there was a progression from destruction through rebirth. I personally have a very strong opinion that these are two very, very different things. So as we continue walking through, we've just walked through the museum, and just to keep in mind, what do I mean through the museum? If you look at this picture, straight ahead, you can see the trees, and then you can see a gateway and two people standing in the gateway. That, in fact, is the museum. That's a path that walks above the museum. And what we're doing today is we're not going underground into the museum, but we're continuing on to the Warsaw Ghetto Plaza with the two very, very distinct sculptures that you see together in the top slide and then separated on the bottom slides. Rachel, b'vakasha.
Okay, so you can see that we are now in an empty square and facing that wall at the very end of the square. Indeed, I think even physically, this is the central square of Yad Vashem.
Whoops, sorry.
This is the central square in the periphery of Yad Vashem. And it carries the name so typically and so characteristically connected to the way Holocaust commemoration was at least started in the earlier years in Israel. It's called Warsaw Square, because in the collective memory of Israelis, especially of the early years, and to a large extent to this very day, the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising had acquired a focal central place. It's all about the fact that we did rise up. So if you were with me, and had it been a regular, very warm, very hot Israeli day, I will tell you, let us get closer to the monument, have a look at its two parts, and then next to us on the left-hand side, you can even see on the square the shade of one of the trees. There are many trees with benches, and I will take you to sit in the shade, because one of the things all of us, when we are guiding people outdoors in Israel, pay attention to is that you are in the shade and you drink enough water. And I'm sure all your tour guides have nudged you to do that all the time. And if they hadn't, they should have. So you approached the sculpture, and Ezra referred to it as two, and I would like to say, no, they're two parts of the one, which I know exactly. that Ezra meant as well. The artist is Rappaport. And at the time when he creates this, he is a Jew, of course, and a famous sculptor, but he's not an Israeli. He lives in Paris. The commission to build it does not come from the state of Israel, nor from Yad Vashem, nor from the city of Jerusalem. The commission comes from Warsaw. And he is asked to do this monument because in Warsaw, in the post-year wars, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is seen as part of the Polish uprising against the Nazis. And it plays well into the hands of socialist, communist, if you wish, Poland after World War II, where the uprising powers being of the left-hand side of the Zionist ideological continuum, Hashoa and the Bund, which is not so Zionist but still socialist, that worked nicely into the local narrative of us socialists against the fascists. It's only after a few years that after a while, somebody remembers in Israel that actually we should have a sample of our own Rappaport monument, and they go to the artist and ask for him to create a replica, if you wish, of the same. Now, as you look at the two parts, I would like to say a word about three significant differences. Let us start with the fact that in Warsaw, if you've been in March of the Living or any other of the tours, the two parts of the sculpture are placed back to back. And you see one at the center of a park with stairs underneath where all your kids on March of the Living have their picture taken. And I don't think there is one single group of kids who went on March of the Living that didn't have their picture taken on those stairs. And then you get up and walk like a semicircle to the outskirts of the park, and then you will see the other part of the monument. Here in Israel, the two parts are placed one next to the other. The other difference is that the Warsaw sculpture part is made of marble, so therefore it's lighter, and here it's bronze and therefore darker. But there is another third significant difference that is sort of a little bit more light-hearted. So Rappaport, being a realistic type of sculptor, creates in the spirit of those years, the late 40s, and when he creates human bodies, you can see that they are naked, more or less, or very little dressed. The physicalness of the body is important. Look at the left-hand side of the monument, of course. So the woman figure, the one who has her her arm over her head, in Warsaw, she is naked. You can see her breasts. But this is Jerusalem, and this is Israel, and that would not pass. So Rappaport had to recreate that part and cover the woman's breasts for decency. So much for that. Having said and looked at these bigger or minuter differences, I want to say the following. Rappaport is not an Israeli. He lives in Paris. The sculpture is not commissioned by Israel. And yet, I do not think that there is a piece of Holocaust-related art that is more or a better articulation of the Israeli attitude to the Holocaust. And that is the total separation between heroes, fighters, and the rest of them. And even the way, the day that we are commemorating as of tonight, that you call nicely Yom Hashoa, and I know that when rabbis address that from the pulpit, they know fully well that that is not the name. The full name is Yom HaZikaron LaShoah L'Gvura. I yet have to see the American rabbi that will say all that from the pulpit. And I totally understand why not. But the full name means the day of commemoration of Holocaust and heroism. And as my generation is growing up in Israel, it is made very clear to us what is heroism during the Holocaust. Heroes were the ghetto fighters, heroes were the partisans, and heroes were the people who trained to become parachutists and were dropped behind Nazi enemy lines in Yugoslavia and Hungary and Slovakia at the time, like the famous Hannah Seneš and 30 more people who we do not remember, but at least we remember Hannah Seneš. Those were our heroes. Everybody else was not. The day of commemoration of heroism and Shoah, yeah, heroes are the people I just mentioned. Everybody else is Shoah. And then there is an additional adjective or adverb rather, and they went like sheep to the slaughter. Israelis, and to some extent, Jews outside of Israel, for 2, maybe 3 generations, were raised to believe that we had the right to sit in judgment. That it was more heroic to stand on a rooftop in the Warsaw Ghetto, which I trust was heroic. But was it more heroic than sharing a slice of bread with another inmate in Auschwitz? So this is the techie Rachel Korazim coming to you right now, and I'm asking you to get up from your comfortable seats in the shade and come back to the sunshine and face the complete monument, the one with the physical bodies of the fighters and the one with the others. The fighters are upright, looking up and strong. The others are all bowed and they practically don't have a body. And but for the Moses-like figure, all of them have their heads and eyes down. And they are led to where they are led by a few soldiers with just a few, 1 or 2 bayonets on the back. And the suggestion and the question is, so why didn't they jump, run, fight, etc.? Why am I inviting you back to the monument where you can get closer and see these two together? Is because this is when you will notice, and this is the techie Rachel Korazim, I have no proof for that, just my belief and my sentimentalism, that the artist who created the backdrop for this had left the third wall empty, the one on the left. Can you see? There is a wall for the Shoah element, there is the wall for the heroic element, and there is a third one on the left. And I believe that it is left there until the day comes that we will know not to separate them. And the sculptor and the artist will come, who will create a united, unified image of our terrible loss in those days. Wow, I spoke much more than I intended to. So you'll have to take it over, Ezra, now.
So I just want to, obviously we are talking about one sculpture, but it's not by coincidence that Nathan Rappaport divided them and made them into 2 units connected by a brick wall. And if you look, it's not only on the left that you see the fighters standing upright. If you look on the right, you can see that all the Jews are looking down. You see the bayonets and the helmets on the back row, but there are 2 figures that are not looking down on the right-hand side of the sculpture. And those 2 figures, can anybody make them out? Just unmute themselves, unmute yourself if you can see which ones they are.
A child and the Moses figure.
The Moses figure and the child.
There's also one looking back.
And there's one looking back. That's
very
correct.
back.
That's correct. And so setting aside the one looking back for a moment and looking at the child and the Moses figure, the child and the Moses figure represent the spectrum of life. The child who's naive, and as I read it, again, this is just as I read it, as the person, the rabbi, the person of faith who's looking up to the heavens. And then what is the person doing there looking back? Looking at what was, potentially what was. And remember, for those of you that might be familiar with this, the pillars of fire in the Eshtaol forest was also done by Nathan Rappaport. And if you go back to the way Rachel began with the article that she found just today, that we translated today, that ceremony that's described in that article actually took place in the Eshtaol forest. And then we try to put it all together into one, and it raises some very challenging questions, some very challenging issues, as how did Israeli society look at the memory of the Holocaust when Yad Vashem was built? when this monument memorial was established, and how does it look at it today? And very quickly, and please cut me off, Rachel, if I go on a bit too much about this.
I'm
But
fine.
the
I'll do it
date
shorter.
we're talking about today is the 27th of Nisan. 27th of Nisan is stuck in the middle. No connection whatsoever really to anything, but connected to everything. And the big debate as to when to commemorate Yom HaShoah took place after the Shoah, obviously at the beginning of the state in the early 1950s, trying to figure out when do you commemorate this day. The people that led the revolt wanted to do it today, the 20th of April. But what was the 20th of April in 1943 during the days of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? What was the day? Right, the Seder night. They wanted to commemorate the Shoah on the Seder night. It also happened to be Hitler's birthday. They want to commemorate it on the Seder night. Obviously, you can't commemorate the Shoah destruction on the Seder night. And so, another conversation. The Orthodox parties came and said, we don't need to pick another date because we have Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of the month of Tevet. Yom HaKadisha Klali, that is the overall Jewish Memorial Day. That doesn't fit because that puts it into a big package with all kinds of other destructions. Then other people came and said, you can't do it in the month of Nisan because you can't eulogize in the month of Nisan. So what date do they come up with? They come up with a date which is exactly 1 week after Pesach, exactly 1 week before Yom HaZikaron, leading to Yom HaAtzmaut. And if you look at the progression in the Jewish calendar from Pesach, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaAtzmaut, this is the modern exodus from bad to good, from destruction to rebirth. End of Pesach, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut. And the 27th of Nisan was chosen for a number of other reasons as well. But it shows that the conflicts and the conversations that we have about creating a Jewish state today and how we live Jewish lives today didn't just start now and didn't just start 20 or 30 years ago, and the arguments didn't start then. They were seminal to the whole conversation on the establishment of the state. And if you look at it in that context, this memorial is really a representative not only of those that stood strong and fought and those that were claimed to have gone like sheep to the slaughter, but it's symbolic of the way the state looked at the Shoah then, and now with our eyes today, the way the state maybe looks at it and the people look at it maybe a bit differently, and we'll see as we continue on. Rachel?
Okay, please lead us through because we need to cross the square and continue a little bit to the west, I'm thinking, to our next stop. Okay, so here we are now. One back, please. Thank you. Facing the boxcar, facing one of these wagons of the trains that were used to transport Jews towards the death camps, the concentration camps. By the way, the history of how we get this boxcar is when towards the end of the 80s, the communist empire starts to shake. It happens in the northern Polish city of Gdansk, where a dock worker named Lech Walesa is leading the solidarity movement. Fast forward, he will become president of Poland. And the communist regime will just fall down like dominoes. We are not going there right now. When it is done, he had managed to locate two of these boxcars, the real ones that were used for the transport of Jews to the death camps. And one of the two will go to Washington, D.C., to the American Holocaust Museum, and the other will come to Yad Vashem. And just the study of the two ways of presenting them to the public in these two places is so representative of the cultures of commemoration. Because in America, and this is not a critique, just observation, but in America, When you teach history, you do heritage. Villages. And therefore the boxcar is placed smack inside the building, and visitors can walk through and touch the walls and see the suitcases on the floors with the names and react. And I have been standing there for a long time listening to them when I was there, and you get from them the reactions that the planners must have wanted. Wow, it's so eerie. Wow, it makes you feel as if. That's America. You come to Israel and it's a totally different culture. We, in our culture, when smack in the middle of winter, we have a holiday of light. We're not able to use them, only to look at them. We pay respect by distance, by not touching, by maintaining our distance. Do not get too close. Take off your shoes. It's holy. And in the same way, the boxcar is presented to the visitors at Yad Vashem at a distance. Do not get too close. It's not something to touch or to experience. Just standing by. And that's the way it is. And next to it, a poem is placed by Dan Pagis. And you could bring it on the screen, not that I do not know it by heart, but it will be nicer for the audience, of whom I trust there are quite a few who know it as well. Ezra, could you click, please? Thank you. This is a very short poem, and we'll do the Hebrew very quickly. כתוב בעיפרון בקרון החתום, כאן בשלוח הזה אני חווה עם הבל בני, אם תראו את בני הגדול קין בן אדם, תגידו לו שאני. Written in pencil in the sealed railway car. Here in this carload, I'm Eve with Abel, my son. If you see my other son, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I, no full stop. Look first of all at the use of the biblical metaphor of the first murder ever, and how this places this poem within the concept of the first homicide.
Move back just a bit. Thanks.
Yeah, homicide. But if you study Torah, if you listen to the story of Cain and Abel read to you throughout the years, you know one thing for sure. The Torah doesn't tell us if either Adam or Eve had taken sides, if they favored Cain over Hevel or the other way around. Dan Pagis, when using the biblical metaphor, will tell you, my story is different. My homicide is different. In my story, I know that Eve would have taken sides. In my case, Eve would be in the boxcar, holding on to her son that is to be the victim, sending a message outside to outside. Now, it's interesting how the message, first of all, if you look at those lines, I am Eve with Abel, my son, works nicely in English, but you lose half of the meaning. Because if you look at the words in Hebrew, Abel in the original Hebrew is not Abel, it's Hevel. And Hevel is also breath, like especially in the winter, when it's cold outside and you breathe, you can see the hevel of your breath in the cold air. So actually the poem could read, I, Eve, hanging on in the darkness and the suffocation of the boxcar to see whether my son is still breathing. So hevel b'ni could be my son Abel, but also the breath of my son. And as soon as she has done that, she is now talking to us. If you see my other son, Cain, son of Adam, two quick comments on that one. First of all, the total recognition of the humanity of the perpetrator. Eve recognizes the fact that the perpetrator is her son equally. Do not rush away by calling the Nazis beasts. No beast does that. Only humans do that. You need to recognize the potential of humans to be that. And Dan Pagis is very early in saying that when all of Israeli literature is talking about the Nazi beast. No, Eve knows that Cain is also her son. And if you see my other son, Cain, son of Adam, of man, you immediately think of the Hebrew meaning, because the expression Ben Adam means the son of Adam, but also means a human being. And therefore, in this line,
Rachel, can you
is
move
of
back a
course,
bit?
yes, a parent. And then the message that is, because there are no words, because the train had reached its destination and she didn't have time to tell us, or because we need to read this as one often does in rituals of Yom Hashoa. כאן במשלוח הזה אני חווה עם הבל בני, אם תראו את בני הגדול קין בן אדם, תגידי לו שאני כאן במשלוח הזה. Here in this carload I am Eve with Abel my son. If you see my son, and tell him that I'm here in this box, etc., etc. So again, the additional Dan Pagis message, if you wish, is that back in the Torah story, there was one Eve, one Adam, one Cain, one Abel. But in my story, thank you very much, every day more than one train, and in each one of those, many more than one boxcars, and in each one of those, many more than one Eve holding on to the last breathing of their sons. So this is a central monument, relatively as compared to some of the others. No, it only dates back to the early 90s of the 20th century. And I think I will let you, Ezra, take it from here. You absolutely have to. I've spoken so much.
I could listen some more, it's okay. And then we continue. Just one quick thing about the boxcar. There's a story, and I tend to believe it's true. It might not be true, but it conveys a very strong message. This boxcar is a very significant thing, and a lot of work went to bring it here by a whole series of different people, a long time, a lot of money. And the boxcar was placed where it's placed on these tracks. And the next day, a woman called Yad Vashem and said, you have to move the boxcar. And the person she spoke to said, yeah, right. And she said, no, you have to move the boxcar. I'm a survivor. And now I look out my window every day and I'm going to see a boxcar. You have to move the boxcar. Now think about what Yad Vashem is about. Yad Vashem is about commemoration. It's about memory. It's about allowing people to figure out their place in this big picture of memory, and all of a sudden it's in somebody's face. But look at everything that was invested in bringing this boxcar here, building the tracks, putting it where it is. There's no way that they were going to move it. And so there you see the collective versus the individual, and where collective memory is the boxcar and Dan Pagis, the individual memory is this woman in her home in Ein Karim, which is just down the slope. The end result was trees were planted. She can't see the boxcar anymore from her window, and everybody moves on in the direction that they move on. But it shows how every little thing, and even well-intentioned things that are done, there's nothing that actually stands on its own. There's always some sort of effect that happens in every aspect of memory that takes place. And now we've moved through, and we're looking at a monument which is to the Jewish soldiers and partisans who fought during the time of the Shoah. And this is a very striking monument in that, as you can see, it's a straight, upright, almost spear, almost like the warhead of a spear, with 6 sarcophagi all around it, making a Magen David, making a Star of David. And in fact, if you go through Yad Vashem and look for monuments that are upright, until very, very recently, the only monuments that you would find that were upright were the monuments to those people who fought against the Nazis. This specific, we'll get to what do the monuments look like to those who didn't fight against the Nazis. But specifically, this is a very, I guess one could say, special monument in that it was to those people who were not necessarily connected to the Zionist movement, not necessarily connected to those people who fought in the ghettos, not necessarily connected to those people who had anything to do with building up the state of Israel. And yet these are people who played a very, very significant role. It's a monument that was built by someone named Bernard Fink, an artist named Bernard Fink. And his intention was to show all the different directions that people came from in order to fight. And one specific person that Rachel put here is a woman named Paulina Gelman, who served in the Russian and the Soviet army, was in the Air Force, and actually served quite a long time in the Air Force. As you can see, was a very well-decorated officer. She's someone who never made Aliyah. She never came to Israel. She was a loyal Soviet citizen, later on a loyal Russian citizen. And yet she's someone who is commemorated at Yad Vashem with this monument, or through this monument. She's commemorated at Yad Vashem in later years through other things as well. She also wrote a memoir. And yet this is a face that, just asking, is there anyone sitting here or watching here today that recognizes this woman or recognizes the name of Paulina Gelman? Can either raise your hand or open your mic. Anybody recognize her, know the name? Well, like her, there were many, many, many others. And considering the fact that there were many, many others, and we go back to the Avenue of the Righteous, remembering that there's symbolism throughout all of Yad Vashem for those people who we don't know. We don't know their names. We don't know who they were. But we know that they did something for somebody, for many people. And it's part of the unknown and the very known of memory of the Shoah. And those of you that remember where this monument is, it's kind of at the edge of the Yad Vashem complex. Down beneath on the other side is the valley that eventually leads down toward the Valley of the Communities. Rachel, would you like to add?
No, because I think we are running short of time, so maybe we pick one more monument. Ezra, do you agree?
Yes, so we won't do this monument. I'll just say, notice this is a monument that we're doing it just shortly, right? This is a monument to those people who were victims. Notice the difference between this monument, again, a very well-known monument, and the upright monuments. You don't see the top, you don't see the bottom. It's just people wrapping themselves around the barbed wire. Rachel, where do you want me to stop?
I think that we should do the oily score. What do you say?
Yep.
Okay, so we are looking at a part of Yad Vashem, actually one of the very first monument to be built there, and it carries an interesting name in Hebrew, Ohel Yizkor, the tent of commemoration. And I think, although my knowledge of English is not perfect yet, I do know that tents do not look like this. So obviously there is a meaning in the name that does not reflect the way the structure looks. We will get virtually, of course, into the monument itself, but I'd like you to pay attention, and I even took the trouble to put it on the right-hand side of the slide, that there are two parts to the building. The lower part is done with uncut stones. And you may know that in our tradition, uncut stones, even Sherlo Allah Aleha Barzel, are used for the building of an altar. So if there is at least at one stage or one spot in Yad Vashem a hint at the possibility of there was a sacrifice here, maybe it's here in this building, and then on this altar-like structure of the lower part is the superposition of this heavy cement thing that it is not like a tent. Could the word tent suggest that just like when we were traveling in the desert, we had a tent rather than a temple, that such things could happen to us when we were out of our country? I'm not sure. However, I would tell you to stand with your back to the building and look at the door, at the wall facing it for a scripture. So can we have that picture, Ezra, please? All right, on the wall, and could you click so that we have the text on our slide? We have it in Ivrit and in English. ונתתי להם בביתי ובחומותיי יד ושם. Then the scripture on the wall misses a few words, טוב מבנים ומבנות, שם עולם אתן לו, אשר לא יכרת. That is repeated. To them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. That is kept in the part that we have the wall. An everlasting name that will endure forever. One could spend a lot of time thinking about the choice of this particular verse and how for the people who planned the Yad Vashem, the whole richness and treasure of the Jewish bookshelf is there for them to choose this verse of Isaiah 56, the 5th verse. And again, I could spend a long time with it, but I will try to make it concise. And I shall give them, and to them I will give within my temple and its walls. Beveiti uvechomotai. One could spend some time about the question, the Holocaust did not happen here. Why do we commemorate it here? Normal peoples of the world, they commemorate events where they had happened. It did not happen here, but the statement by the choice of the verse says, wherever we are, in our temples, in our walls, just like when you build a Jewish new home and you break a glass to remember that which was destroyed, just like when you finish a building, you leave a corner unfinished. To build your Jewish state, you will have in it a place of commemoration for that which was destroyed far away. Yad Vashem, which in Hebrew is a name and a memorial, a commitment to remember the names, not just the numbers. And then you rush to the end where it says, that shall be endured forever. And in order maybe to give an additional meaning to that part of the verse, I would say that you need to read the context and read the whole chapter. And when you do, you will realize that it is taken from a prophecy that Isaiah addresses to the eunuchs, to the man whose ability to create life was taken away from them through torture. And it's an awkward moment. And why did you have to bring it up, Rachel? I would have been happier without it. And I will say no, entertain the following, that when you commemorate the Shoah, you commemorate also the potential, the endless number of those who were never to be born. So I think that just like the choice of this particular verse from the book of Isaiah, there are so many of the important notions. Yes, it belongs here. Yes, we are committed to the names. Yes, we will not and we will not let them be cut off, and they will endure forever. So a commitment to remember. This is the verse I will tell you that carry you to walk into
Sorry, Rachel, can you
commemoration.
can't hear you.
This is the verse that you are to take with you as you walk into that inside space. And let us walk in it. Can we, Ezra?
Yes,
With
just
further click.
two quick words about this. Notice that the Hebrew is in the negative and the English translation is in the positive.
Okay, I haven't
The
noticed.
Hebrew
Yeah.
says lo yikaret, which means will not be cut off. And it's
Right.
a play on words. Yad Vashem, the hand will not be cut off. And then if you go to the book of Psalms and think of, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand be cut off. So that's one thing. So this is where the translation is also a commentary. And the second thing is that it's a physical and a spiritual memorial that they're talking about. And afterwards, if you go and if you like, we'll send you the article, or the article that was translated that Rachel spoke about at the beginning. The main declaration made by the president of Israel when he declared Yad Vashem was that there is memory, and that memory has to be tangible. If we don't make it tangible, we haven't done anything. And Yad Vashem, the concept from Isaiah, was taken to this mountain to create a place of tangible memory.
Ezra, I think we want to walk inside and make a note of the fact that in the whole of the Yad Vashem campus, there are two, I'm not talking about the museum, just the campus, that have an outside, like the one we have seen, and an inside. The other one is the Children's Memorial, pawn to remain silent. Tour guides are not to speak and to explain. Yad Vashem recognizes that particular moment that the visitor needs to just collect yourself, stand on this platform, and look at the eternally burning fire and recite the names Buchenwald, Treblinka, Auschwitz, Chelmno, Belzec, etc. These are the major camps that were known at the time that this was built. And they are underneath our ashes.
We can't hear.
Underneath the slab that we see, the stone, I believe there are ashes from a concentration camp, so therefore symbolically this is a place of burial. I think that this is a good place for us to conclude. What do we say? What do you think, Ezra, as we leave people to contemplate for themselves?
Yes, I think, thank you very much, Rachel. As you can see, there are other slides that we're going to be related to. The Children's Memorial, the Janusz Korczak Memorial, the Valley of the Communities, and we could go on and on. But we want to thank you very much, Rachel, for sharing your thoughts, sharing your wisdom. And thank you all for joining, knowing that Yom Hashoa v'Hagvura begins now in Israel and begins in various times over the next number of hours, wherever you are. And we hope that your commemoration is meaningful and that we remember each name and not just the 6 million as a number.
Ezra, you know, you could just stop the share so we could say see the people as we say goodbye to them.
Bye, תודה רבה.
Thank you very much, תודה רבה.
בבקשה.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. You can turn on your videos
Thank
if
you.
you want so that you can say goodbye.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה. לילה טוב.
Pleasure. לילה טוב.
יישר כוח.
All my students, I'm waiting for you in 45 minutes in class.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. תודה רבה.
בבקשה, pleasure.
Susan Marty.
Yes, thank you.
Peter?
Thank you so much. Bye from London.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Hope you get
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm glad you could make it.
So are we. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Peter?
תודה רבה.
בבקשה.
את נחמדה מאוד.
תודה רבה. תודה.
I gotta come to Israel now and get the tour in real life.
Okay, we'll take you there.
Yes?
Are you there?
Yes.
Oh, it was terrific. I wrote down a couple of things that they said that were just unbelievable.
Thank you.
Okay, רחל, אני אסיים.
How did you?